Have you ever felt at some point in your life that you need to go back, even without knowing exactly why? That strange feeling in the chest, a silent tightness, a restlessness that made no logical sense, but that insisted on saying, "Do not proceed, what if I told you that?" In many cases, this feeling is neither accident nor imagination, but a divine alert. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear might make you rethink decisions that seem small, but carry lasting consequences. If I hadn't turned back then, I wouldn't be here today. This phrase is not only impactful, it carries the weight of a life preserved, of a destiny interrupted, of a deliverance that occurred before the destruction. I am not going to tell you yet what happened that day, nor the magnitude of the danger that lay ahead. The most important thing for now is not the event itself, but the moment of decision, the exact moment when someone chose to listen to something that didn't come from the outside, but from within. Or rather, from above. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. Everything seemed normal. The routine continued as always. No visible signs of threat. But suddenly, something changed in the spiritual environment. An unusual thought, a discomfort that didn't fit the situation. An inexplicable urge to stop, wait, change course, cancel an appointment. How many times do we ignore these signs because they don't make sense to reason? And how many times has heeding this silent warning been exactly what kept us alive? Within the universe of faith, especially when we talk about prophetic messages and testimonies of deliverance, there is a truth that transcends generations. God still speaks. He speaks in subtle, profound, personal ways. Not always with thunder or spectacular visions, but often with a simple, "Don't go, wait, turn back." And whoever learns to recognize this voice also learns to survive situations that, in human eyes, would seem inevitable. Have you ever wondered how many tragedies could have been avoided if someone had heeded this type of warning? How many accidents, how many losses, how many stories interrupted because the warning was ignored? At the same time, how many testimonies are there of people who escaped by seconds, by a minimal change of route, by a decision that seemed unimportant at that moment? Stories like these are not rare. They are simply not told with the depth they deserve. Perhaps, as you watch this video, something within you is being awakened. An old memory, a specific day, a deliverance that only made sense later. Or perhaps you are here because you need to learn to better discern these spiritual signs, because you feel that God is trying to speak, but you still don't know how to listen. Whatever the reason, it's no coincidence that you are here now. Have you ever experienced this? Or do you know someone who has? There is a very fine line between obedience. There is a division between trusting in divine guidance and simply following one's own logic. And it is precisely along these lines that many stories are defined. Some end in pain. Others become living testimonies that heaven intervenes before the worst happens. What differentiates one from the other, almost always, is a single instant of spiritual sensitivity. And it is about that instant, that decisive second, that divine feeling of warning, that phrase that changed everything, that we will talk about from now on. Because what happened after that decision reveals something much greater than a simple deliverance. It reveals how God acts when someone chooses to listen. As we journey through this reflection together, let me tell you something from the heart. This type of message only makes sense when it reaches people who feel, who live, and who recognize these moments of spiritual awakening in their daily lives. Perhaps, as you listen to me now, something within you is stirring. A memory that has returned, a deliverance that was never fully explained, or even a recent warning that you are still trying to understand. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far. Your story might be exactly the sign that someone else needs to read today. When you comment, you're not just writing words, you're creating connection, generating identification, and helping this message reach hearts that may be going through a difficult time right now. And if, at any point in this video, you felt that inner click, that silent confirmation that God still speaks, consider also leaving a like. This simple gesture shows that this content needs to continue being shared, that this type of testimony still has a place and purpose. And if you feel that this channel speaks to you, that these prophetic messages, these accounts of deliverance before destruction, strengthen your faith and sharpen your spiritual sensitivity, subscribe. Not for numbers, but for community. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, people who may be one step away from ignoring a warning that could change everything. Here, we don't share stories for empty impact, but for transformation. Every comment, every like, every new subscription helps this message cross borders, screens, and routines, reaching where it needs to reach. And the most beautiful thing is knowing that no one walks alone. Each shared experience becomes confirmation for another heart. So, while you reflect on all of this, stay with me. Because now we're going to delve deeper into that specific moment, that exact second when everything could have moved forward. But it didn't. Something happened there. Something that changed the course of history. And that's exactly where this message begins to reveal itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely here that many stories diverge between continuation and interruption. The most striking thing about these testimonies of deliverance is not the danger itself, but the scenario that precedes it. Almost always, everything seemed absolutely normal. The routine followed its usual course. The mind was occupied with common tasks, automatic decisions, repeated thoughts. There was no visible sign of threat, no external alarm, no logical reason to suspect anything out of place. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this moment so decisive. The danger does not announce itself, it hides. It is at this point that something changes inside. It's not noise, it's not panic, it's not explicit fear. It's more subtle, a thought that doesn't usually appear, a feeling of urgency without explanation, a slight but persistent discomfort, as if something were out of alignment. Many describe it as a tightness in the chest, others as a restless unease, still others as a gentle, almost imperceptible voice, telling you to stop, wait, go back. And the most curious thing is that, rationally, there is no reason for it. The mind tries to justify, minimize, sweep it under the rug. After all, moving forward seems easier than questioning one's own path. This is where decisions come in. Small, silent, invisible to outsiders, but full of impact. The choice between ignoring or obeying, between accelerating or braking, between persisting or retreating, between trusting only one's own logic or making room for a direction that doesn't spring from reason, but from the spirit. And this choice reveals much about our spiritual mindset, about the level of sensitivity we develop along the journey. There's a hidden truth that's almost never stated directly. Not every warning comes with an explanation. Sometimes the explanation only appears later. And, in many cases, it only appears because someone decided to obey before understanding. That's why so many people ignore this type of warning. We live trained to act based on visible evidence, concrete data, predictable results. But spiritual discernment works on a different frequency. It doesn't shout, it doesn't force, it doesn't impose. It invites, it whispers, it points in a direction and waits for you to trust enough to follow it. In Christian spirituality, this is called spiritual discernment. It is the ability to perceive beyond the surface, to grasp signs that do not come from the physical environment, but from the inner world. The Bible describes this as the still, small voice, the divine guidance that manifests itself not in a strong wind or an earthquake, but in silence. And perhaps this is one of the greatest challenges of our generation, learning to listen amidst so much noise. Noise of haste, of opinion, of demands, of external expectations. The more noise around us, the harder it becomes to hear what comes from within. And yet, some people listen, not because they are special, but because they have chosen to value this sensitivity. They feel the warning and, even without fully understanding it, choose to obey. Sometimes this means delaying by a few minutes. Other times, completely changing a plan. In certain cases, it means giving up something that seemed important. From the outside, it may seem like an exaggeration. From the inside, it is a choice that carries peace, even without explanation. And it is precisely this inexplicable peace that usually confirms that the decision was right. The contrast becomes apparent when we look at those who ignore it, not out of malice but out of habit. Unease arises but is stifled. The warning sign appears but is rationalized. It's all in my head, I'm exaggerating. There's no point in going back now. And so, the person continues. Things don't always happen immediately. Sometimes the impact comes later. Other times it comes too quickly. And when it does, it leaves behind a silently echoing question. What if I had listened? These moments speak not only of physical deliverance, but of inner transformation. They reveal how seemingly small decisions shape entire destinies. They reveal behind-the-scenes stories that could have ended differently. They reveal that there is a dimension of life that cannot be explained solely by logic, but needs to be lived with sensitivity. And the more one learns to recognize this divine guidance, the more one realizes that these warnings are not rare. They simply demand attention. Perhaps, as you follow this reflection, you are realizing that you have already experienced something similar. An ordinary day that could have ended differently. A simple decision that changed everything. Or perhaps you are understanding that you need to adjust the way you have been dealing with these signs. Developing discernment is not something instantaneous. It is a journey of silence, of listening, of inner alignment. And every journey begins with the willingness to stop and recognize that not all answers come ready-made. This is just the beginning of this conversation, because when we look more closely at these moments, we realize that there are even deeper layers behind them. Layers that reveal not only the danger avoided, but the purpose behind the deliverance. And it is precisely in this direction that this reflection begins to move now. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a very common misconception that needs to be carefully and truthfully addressed. Many people confuse divine guidance with fear, and this ends up causing important signs to be ignored. Fear paralyzes, disorganizes, generates anxiety and confusion. Supernatural guidance, even when firm, carries a strange sense of clarity. It's not despair. It's a silent call pointing to an invisible limit, as if something were saying, "Do not advance further." And recognizing this difference completely changes how we face these moments. The warning that comes from God doesn't arrive to cause panic, but to protect. He doesn't push, he guides. He doesn't shout, he directs. Often, it comes accompanied by an inexplicable peace, even when the decision seems illogical. That's why so many people, looking back, can say with conviction that it wasn't a coincidence. It was deliverance. It was preemptive care. It was an intervention that happened behind the scenes, before the destruction became visible. When we look at the scriptures, we realize that this pattern repeats itself more often than we imagine. Before the flood, Noah was warned. Before the destruction of Sodom, Lot was warned to leave without looking back. Before the famine in Egypt, Joseph received revelations that allowed him to prepare. In all these cases, there was a common element. The warning came beforehand, but it demanded a decision. God showed, guided, revealed. It was up to humankind to obey, even without having all the answers at that moment. This reveals a powerful hidden truth. Deliverance almost always begins long before the danger manifests itself. And we're not just talking about old stories or those far removed from our reality. Current testimonies follow the same pattern. People who changed a schedule, swapped a route, canceled a trip, gave up on a seemingly harmless choice. Then, they discovered that something serious had happened exactly where they would have been. When these accounts are told, there's always a striking detail. No one can rationally explain why they decided to act differently that day. The decision didn't come from logic, it came from sensitivity. And that's where the prophetic aspect of this type of warning comes in. In this context, prophecy is not spectacle. It's not grandiose predictions announced aloud. It's spiritual perception applied to practical life. It's when someone, even without understanding everything, feels the need to adjust their path. It's a discreet, personal revelation, often too intimate to be shared at that moment. And perhaps that's why so many deliverances go unnoticed. People continue living, unaware of what was averted. Only later, when the information arrives, does the impact become apparent. This happens more often than you imagine. But the story isn't always told. There isn't always a visible tragedy to compare it to. Sometimes, the deliverance is from something that never materialized precisely because someone heeded the warning. And this requires spiritual maturity to recognize. It requires a mindset that understands that not everything that matters can be seen, measured, or explained. Some of the greatest transformations happen precisely in the invisible realm. There's also a delicate point here. God warns, but doesn't force. The warning comes, the direction is given, but the decision remains human. And it is in this space of choice that many journeys take different paths. Some people feel the warning and ignore it. Others feel it and obey. Not because they are more spiritual, but because they have learned, along the way, to trust that voice. They have already seen the positive impact of this obedience before. They have already experienced the difference between persisting and retreating. They have already understood that listening early avoids unnecessary pain later. This perception changes the way someone lives. It changes the way they make decisions, plan, and act in their daily lives. The person begins to live with more attention, more presence, more listening. It's not a life of fear, it's a life of alignment. It's not about waiting for tragedies, it's about walking with spiritual awareness. And the more someone develops this sensitivity, the more they realize that these warnings don't only appear in extreme moments, but also in seemingly simple choices that, later on, reveal a much greater impact. Perhaps you're beginning to realize that some episodes of your own story take on a different meaning in light of this. Decisions that seemed impulsive but that now make sense. Paths that were interrupted without clear explanation. People who left your life at the right time. Situations that didn't progress, even when everything indicated they would. None of this needs to be seen as chance. Sometimes, it's simply the result of a silent direction that was acting behind the scenes. And the more we delve into this topic, the clearer it becomes that these warnings aren't just about avoiding the worst, but about guiding us towards the right purpose. They serve not only to save us from destruction, but to align our journey with what truly matters. And when that switch flips, faith ceases to be mere belief and becomes a living, daily experience, applied to the real decisions of life. It is precisely at this point that this reflection begins to gain even more depth, because behind each heated warning lies a story that could have ended differently, and understanding this opens up space for even more intense revelations about purpose, time, and direction. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely here that everything ceases to be theory and becomes real life. It is here that the decision leaves the realm of reflection and enters the territory of the irreversible. After the warning, after the unease, after that feeling that wouldn't go away, came the turning point. There was no noise, no dramatic announcement. There was only a silent choice, to turn back, a seemingly insignificant delay, a route altered at the last minute, an appointment canceled without a convincing explanation. A simple don't go that didn't come with a logical justification, but carried a different weight. At that moment, nothing seemed extraordinary. On the contrary, the decision almost seemed excessive. The mind questioned, tried to negotiate, sought reasons to go ahead. After all, everything was normal. The day continued like any other. There were no visible signs of danger, no headlines, no external urgency. But something inside insisted, and, even without understanding everything, that person decided to obey. It wasn't heroic obedience, it was simple, almost commonplace obedience. And perhaps that's precisely what makes everything so impactful afterward. Minutes or hours later, reality reveals itself. What was once invisible becomes news. A serious accident, an unexpected tragedy, a disaster that no one foresaw. Lives lost, stories interrupted, and then comes the shock. The place where that person would have been, the exact time, the route that was avoided. The realization hits slowly and heavily. If he had followed the original plan, he wouldn't be here to tell the story. And it is at this moment that the phrase takes on body, weight, and truth. If I hadn't turned back then, I wouldn't be here today. This type of revelation has a profound impact because it exposes something we often prefer not to face. Small decisions can have gigantic consequences. A simple act of obedience can be the line between continuing to live and having your story interrupted. It's not about luck. It's not about coincidence. It's about sensitivity, response, and alignment. It's about understanding that, behind the scenes of life, there are things happening that we don't see, but that directly influence the course of our journey. When someone experiences such a deliverance, something changes forever. Their mindset transforms. The way they make decisions is never the same again. They begin to realize that not everything can be rushed, that not every opportunity needs to be seized immediately, that not every seemingly safe path is, in fact, the best. A deeper awareness of time, direction, and purpose emerges. Life ceases to be merely a sequence of automatic actions and becomes a more attentive, sensitive, and connected journey. There is also an emotional weight that is difficult to explain. Gratitude, yes, but also reverence. a silent understanding that something greater intervened. Many report that, after this type of experience, they begin to see other moments from the past in a new light. Situations where something went wrong, but today seem to have been protective. Doors that closed and caused frustration, but which, seen now, prevented greater pain. Timely obedience reveals a hidden truth about the entire journey. Not everything that seemed like a loss was a loss, nor was everything that was delayed a delay. And there's a detail that almost always appears in these accounts. The person didn't feel courageous at that moment, only obedient. There was no sense of heroism, just a step backward. This dismantles the idea that deliverances require grand gestures. Sometimes, they only require humility to recognize that we don't know everything and a willingness to trust in a direction we don't control. This type of obedience doesn't attract anyone's attention, but it sustains consequences that echo throughout life. When tragedy strikes and the gap between "I was supposed to be there" and "I wasn't" becomes real, something is sealed inside. Faith ceases to be a concept and becomes an experience. Spirituality ceases to be discourse and becomes lived experience. And this generates a silent, yet profound transformation that influences future choices, relationships, priorities, and even the way one perceives their own purpose. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of these testimonies is not just the deliverance itself, but the awareness that the warning came early enough to change everything. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was late. The warning came at the right time, awaiting only a response. And that response, however small it may have seemed, completely altered the outcome of the story. This leads us to reflect on how many times we are faced with similar decisions, albeit in different contexts, and on how we are reacting to them. These stories are not meant to generate fear, but to awaken attention, not to paralyze but to align. They reveal that there is a care operating beyond what we can perceive, and that learning to obey is part of spiritual maturity. The more someone understands this, the more they realize that deliverance was not just from that specific day, but from everything that could have come after if the story had taken a different turn. And when we begin to look at these episodes more deeply, an inevitable question arises. If obedience saved a life at that moment, what else might it be silently preserving now, without us even realizing it? This question opens the door to even deeper reflections on purpose, time, and direction, which begin to take shape from here. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a side to this reality that's almost never explored honestly. It's not the celebrated deliverance, but the silent side of ignored opportunities. The side of hasty decisions, of choices made automatically, of logic that tramples sensitivity. How many people feel something different, a subtle warning, an unusual unease, and yet they carry on as if nothing were happening? Not for lack of declared faith, but for excessive haste, for pride disguised as security, for trusting too much in their own interpretation of the situation. We live in a culture that values speed, efficiency, and productivity. Stopping to listen to one's inner self seems like a waste of time. Questioning one's own plans seems like weakness. Going back seems like defeat. And it is precisely in this context that many signs are ignored. The person feels, perceives, but decides to remain silent, decides to go with the flow, decides not to complicate things. The mentality is simple. If there is no visible danger, there is no reason to change. But the hidden truth is that the greatest dangers rarely present themselves with external warnings. They hide behind normality. God, in His way of acting, does not interfere in decisions. He guides, warns, directs, but deeply respects human freedom. This is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects to accept. Heaven warns, but does not compel. The sign comes, the direction is offered, but the choice remains ours. And this brings responsibility. Because when we ignore a warning, it is not for lack of warning, it is by choice. A decision that often only reveals its impact when it is already too late. There are stories that are never told because they end in loss. People who felt something but ignored it, who thought about changing but insisted, who had moments of doubt but chose to follow the original path. And when the impact comes, be it an accident, a tragedy, a profound emotional consequence, the question that remains is not, "Why didn't God warn me?" but, "Why didn't I listen?" This question doesn't come aloud, it comes in silence. Comes in the early hours of the morning. It comes in the weight of a conscience that revisits that decisive moment repeatedly. It's hard to say this, but part of spiritual maturity is recognizing that not all suffering is due to a lack of warning. Sometimes it's due to a lack of response to the warning. This doesn't diminish God's love. On the contrary, it shows how much He respects our autonomy. He doesn't treat us like puppets. He treats us as children capable of choosing. And every choice has consequences, even those made in seconds, even those that seem too small to matter. Haste is one of the greatest enemies of spiritual sensitivity. When everything needs to be done now, there's no room left for listening. Excessive logic also blocks important perceptions. Not everything that is true makes immediate sense. And pride, however subtle, completely closes off any possibility of external guidance. Pride says, I know what I'm doing. Sensitivity says, perhaps there's something I haven't yet perceived. Between these two stances, entire destinies are defined. How many times, looking back, can someone identify that exact moment when something could have been different? An ignored thought, a stifled feeling, piece of advice disregarded, a door forced open when it clearly wasn't opening. These points in the journey don't appear as impending tragedies, but as small cracks in intuition. And ignoring them is easy, because it requires less effort than stopping, reflecting, and sometimes frustrating one's own or others' expectations. This type of reflection isn't meant to generate guilt, but awareness. It's not about living in fear, but with attentiveness. There's a huge difference between living in fear and living in alignment. Spiritual alignment brings peace, even when it demands renunciation. Blind insistence, on the other hand, exacts its price with high emotional interest. When someone learns to discern this, they begin to understand that many no's along the way weren't obstacles, but protections. Many interruptions weren't delays, but disguised deliverances. Perhaps this is one of the most important questions anyone can honestly ask themselves. How many times has God tried to save me from something and I didn't realize it? Or worse, I realized it and ignored it? This question isn't comfortable, but it's transformative. It adjusts your mindset, refines future decisions, and opens up space for a new attitude towards life. A less reactive and more conscious attitude. Less hurried and more sensitive. When that switch flips, something changes in the way one walks. The person begins to pay attention to details, to the behind-the-scenes aspects of decisions, to the small impressions that were previously discarded. Not like someone paranoid, but like someone awakened. Someone who understands that the journey is not made up only of big choices, but of daily micro-decisions that, added together, build or destroy entire paths. And it is precisely at this point that the reflection begins to touch on something even deeper. If God respects our decisions so much, to the point of allowing us to ignore His warnings, what does this reveal about the level of responsibility we have for the course of our own history? This question does not seek an immediate answer, but opens an inner space for revelations that begin to form when we accept looking at our own trajectory with more truth and less defensiveness. Write this down. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything said so far points to a calling that is neither heavy nor threatening, but full of hope. A calling to learn to listen before life needs to shout. Because, contrary to what many think, spiritual sensitivity is not a gift reserved for a few, nor something mystical distant from reality. It is built, developed, honed along the journey, in small daily choices that shape our mindset and adjust our hearts. Learning to listen begins with slowing down. In a world that pushes for quick decisions, immediate answers, and instant certainties, creating space for silence is, in itself, an act of transformation. Silence is not empty. It is full of subtle revelations. It is in silence that thoughts organize themselves, that anxieties take shape, that gentle voice finds space to be perceived. It is no coincidence that so many important directions emerge when someone stops, breathes, and allows themselves to listen without haste. Prayer, in this context, ceases to be merely a request and becomes intimacy. It's not a wish list, but an honest conversation. It is in this place that sensitivity grows, because listening requires closeness. The more intimate the relationship, the easier it is to recognize the voice. And this applies to any relationship. With God it's no different. Intimacy sharpens perception, adjusts the gaze, and prepares the heart to discern when something is not aligned, even if everything seems right on the outside. Obedience also plays a central role in this process, not as a blind obligation but as a conscious response. Every time someone chooses to obey an inner guidance, even without fully understanding it, something is strengthened within. Confidence increases. Perception becomes clearer. The next decision becomes less burdensome. It's like a spiritual muscle being exercised. At first, it seems difficult. Then it becomes natural. And over time, it becomes part of one's way of life. Prophetic deliverances still happen today. Perhaps not with the same biblical scenarios we usually imagine, but with the same essence. Warning beforehand, decision in the middle, and consequence afterward. They occur in professional choices that don't progress, in relationships that end at the right time, in paths that are interrupted without immediate explanation. The hidden truth is that many deliverances will only be fully understood on the other side of the story. And that's okay. Not all understanding needs to be immediate to be true. There is something profoundly liberating in accepting that we don't need to control everything, that we can walk mindfully without anxiety, that we can make conscious decisions without paranoia. Developing spiritual sensitivity doesn't mean living in anticipation of tragedies, but living in alignment with purpose. It means understanding that there is a care operating behind the scenes, even when we don't have access to all the information. And this understanding changes the way we experience the journey. When someone begins to listen more clearly, they realize that many warnings come disguised as small resistances. A persistent discomfort, a door that stubbornly refuses to open, a delay that irritates but protects, a change of plans that frustrates but preserves. None of this needs to be interpreted as punishment or loss. Often it's simply guidance. Guidance that avoids greater pain, deeper impacts, irreversible consequences. There is hope in all of this because learning to listen is not something that is lost with time. On the contrary, it is improved. It doesn't matter how many times someone has ignored signs in the past. The present always offers a new chance for adjustment. Each conscious decision redirects the route. Each intentional pause reorganizes the journey. Each act of obedience repositions the story. The spiritual journey is not linear, but it is responsive. It responds to the disposition of the heart. Perhaps you're realizing that this message isn't just about physical liberation, but about a more aligned, whole, and conscious life. A life where decisions aren't made solely on impulse, pressure, or fear of loss, but through discernment. A life where the mindset shifts from, "I need to run," to "I need to listen." This change in itself is already a profound transformation. And the more one enters this place of listening, the more one realizes that the warnings don't just come to avoid the worst, but to guide towards the best. They don't exist only to prevent destruction, but to preserve purpose, time, and identity. This completely broadens the way one sees one's own history. What once seemed like chance begins to reveal patterns. What once seemed like delay begins to show care. What once seemed like loss begins to gain new meaning. This understanding doesn't end the conversation. It deepens it. Because, from here, even more delicate and revealing questions arise about how to recognize these warnings in daily life, how to differentiate the voice of anxiety from the voice of divine guidance, and how to align practical decisions with this growing sensitivity. These are questions that aren't resolved all at once, but that begin to take shape when someone decides to live with more mindfulness and less haste. It is at this point in the journey that something begins to open up from within, as if a new layer of consciousness is being accessed. And when this happens, listening ceases to be an effort and becomes a natural part of the journey, preparing the ground for even deeper understandings that begin to emerge from here. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation found a place within you. And that, in itself, says a lot. Content like this isn't meant to be skimmed, but to accompany you on your journey, provoke reflection, and help you see decisions with more clarity and sensitivity. If you feel that this type of message strengthens you, guides you, and helps you listen better in your daily life, it makes sense to stay. Subscribe to the channel as someone who decides to embark on a journey, not out of obligation, but because you identify with what is being built. If you want, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple, like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." This creates a connection, showing that the message didn't just stay on the screen, but reach someone on the other side. And if, at any point in this video, you felt that silent identification, that inner understanding that doesn't need many words, leave a like. It's a natural way to signal that this conversation made sense and deserves to continue. There's a video here that complements this topic and further deepens this reflection on listening, discerning, and making more conscious decisions. Click and continue with me there. The conversation doesn't end here, it just keeps going.